At 8:42 a.m., Avery Caldwell noticed her name had disappeared from the meeting agenda. Not crossed out. Not replaced. Just gone. She refreshed the screen twice. Still gone. No notification. No explanation. Only silence. And in corporate environments, silence was never neutral. It was deliberate. She leaned back slowly, watching the conference room glass from across the floor. Inside, people were already gathering. People she had trained. People who used to wait for her approval. Now they weren't even looking for her. At 8:45 a.m., the meeting started without her. No one came to get her. No one texted. No one even pretended to notice. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't a mistake. This was a strategy. A quiet one. A clean one. A surgical removal. No confrontation. No documentation. No liability. Just absence. Avery didn't stand up. Didn't walk in. Didn't interrupt. Because she understood something most people never do until it's too late. If they erase you publicly, they've already decided your fate privately. At 8:51 a.m., she opened her inbox. 43 unread emails. But none of them mattered. Because the only thing that mattered was the one email she didn't receive. The one that used to define her position. Strategy Alignment Executive Review. Her meeting. Her project. Her team. Now. None of it had her name on it. Avery exhaled slowly. Not anger. Not panic. Just clarity. Because invisibility had a pattern. And patterns could be traced. At 9:07 a.m., Avery Caldwell walked to the kitchen with her mug in one hand and her face perfectly calm. That was the first rule of survival in places like Halbrecht Consulting. Never let them see the moment you understand you are being buried. The coffee machine hummed. 2 analysts near the counter went quiet when she entered. Not fully quiet. Just enough. Just enough to tell her they had been talking about something they did not want her hearing. Or someone. She poured coffee slowly, like she had nowhere else to be. Like she still belonged there. One of the analysts offered a thin smile. The kind people wore when they were afraid of being seen taking sides. Big morning? He asked. Avery looked at him, then at the reflection of the office behind him in the chrome surface of the machine. Apparently not, she said. He laughed too quickly. That told her everything. By 9:18 a.m., she was back at her desk, pulling up the last 4 weeks of calendar invitations. Not to relive them. To compare them. That was the difference between emotional people and dangerous people. Emotional people reacted. Dangerous people noticed patterns. She scanned titles, attendee lists, timestamps, forwarded updates, revised room bookings. One by one, the truth began to emerge. 3 weeks ago, she had been removed from a preliminary budget review. No explanation. 2 weeks ago, an operations meeting had been shifted by 30 minutes. The updated invite excluded her. 5 days ago, her access to a shared strategy folder had quietly changed from editor to viewer. Not blocked. Just weakened. That was how smart organizations destroyed someone. Never in one obvious move. Always in increments too small to defend. Too subtle to report. Too deniable to prove. At 9:41 a.m., Avery opened the internal draft deck for the Winterbridge account, the largest restructuring proposal on the floor. Her proposal, or at least it used to be. She froze. Slide 11. A framework she had built over 2 weekends. A phrase she had written herself. A phrase no one else used because no one else thought that way. Operational trust is the first currency of change. It was there. Word for word. But her name was nowhere in the metadata. No author history. No comments from her account. The edit trail had been cleaned. That took effort. That took intent. That took help from someone who knew the system well enough to make theft look like process. She clicked to the contributor panel, and there it was. The newest primary editor on the file. Leah Mercer. Avery stared at the name for a long second. Not because she was shocked. Because some betrayals did not arrive as surprises. They arrived as confirmations. Leah had once sat across from her during late-night deadline pushes, heels off, hair tied back, eating protein bars, and saying she never would have survived the firm without her. Leah had cried in the women's restroom 6 months ago after being humiliated by a partner. Avery had stood beside her and said, "Do not let them make you smaller just because they are threatened by competence." Leah had remembered that line. Apparently, just not the loyalty behind it. At 10:02 a.m., Avery got up and walked past the glass conference room where the executive review was ending. She did not look inside at first. Then she did. Just long enough. Leah was standing near the screen, holding the clicker, presenting Avery's structure with the composure of someone borrowing authority she had not earned. And at the far end of the table sat Daniel Hurst, Senior Managing Director, the man who never raised his voice because he preferred outcomes to scenes. He was nodding. Not impressed. Approving. That was worse. Approval meant this had already been blessed. It meant Leah was not freelancing. It meant someone above had decided Avery was easier to replace than to confront. She kept walking, because the second rule of survival was even more important than the first. If you do not yet have leverage, do not reveal pain. Pain makes people careful. Silence makes them reckless. Back at her desk, her phone buzzed. A message from Leah. "Can we talk later?" Crazy morning. Avery looked at it for 3 seconds, then placed the phone face down. She did not answer. Not because she was hurt, because she refused to donate emotional closure to someone who had just stolen oxygen from her career. At 10:26 a.m., she called up expense approvals from the Winterbridge project. Travel requests, client dinner reimbursements, printing costs, third-party analyst support. Normal things. Until one item stood out. A private working session at the Blackstone Hotel. Approved 2 weeks ago. Attendees listed only as D. Hurst and L. Mercer. Project code. Winterbridge Transition Leadership. Transition. Not review. Not support. Transition. Her eyes narrowed. That word mattered. Words in corporations were never accidental. They were legal camouflage. They were strategic anesthesia. They told the truth only when nobody thought to question them. Transition leadership meant one thing. Someone had been preparing leadership change before the official narrative existed. And if Daniel and Leah had already met privately under that code, then this had started before the meeting she missed. Before the calendar removals. Before the file edits. Maybe even before the praise Daniel gave her at the quarterly review. That thought settled into her chest like ice. Not because it hurt, because it clarified the game. She had not lost ground recently. She had been standing on collapsing floorboards for weeks. At 11:03 a.m., an email arrived from Human Resources. Subject line, Role Scope Realignment Discussion. There it was. The polished knife. No accusation. No criticism. Just a conversation. Just alignment. Just realignment. Corporate language was a burial shroud made of soft fabric. The meeting was set for 2:30 p.m. with HR and Daniel. No agenda attached. No supporting documentation. That meant they wanted compliance before resistance. They wanted her walking into the room blind. They thought shock would do half their work for them. They still thought they understood her. They didn't. Avery stood, picked up her legal pad, and walked to the archives room at the back of the floor where old proposal binders were stored for audit retention. Most employees hated going in there. Too cold. Too dusty. Too far from where visible ambition lived. But invisibility had one advantage. People stopped monitoring where you went. She shut the door behind her and stood still among shelves of dead paperwork and forgotten truth. Then she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to feel it. The humiliation. The insult. The rage. The deep, metallic disgust of realizing that kindness had been studied, mapped, and used against her. 10 seconds. No more. At 11:11 a.m., Avery Caldwell opened her notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of the page. "If they built this quietly, I will destroy it precisely." Then she made 3 columns. What they changed. Who touched it. What they forgot. Because everyone forgot something. Arrogant people, especially. They cleaned slides, but not hotel codes. They shifted meetings, but not the motive beneath them. They rehearsed the transition, but they did it while still needing her to keep the client stable. That meant they had a window of vulnerability. And if she found it before 2:30 p.m., the realignment meeting would not go the way they expected. It would not be a woman being managed out. It would be an architect walking into a room full of amateurs who mistook silence for surrender. At 11:24 a.m., the archive room door opened. Avery looked up. For 1 second, neither woman spoke. Leah stood there with a controlled face and a file in her hand, like she had entered by accident. But not everything needed words. Some truths were already visible in posture. In hesitation, in the slight stiffness of someone who had practiced a lie, but not the moment before it. "I figured you'd be in here," Leah said softly. Avery closed the notebook. "Then you figured correctly." Leah stepped inside and let the door close behind her. "That meeting this morning," she began, "wasn't what it looked like." Avery almost smiled. That was always the opening line. Not a denial. A rearrangement. "It looked like you presenting my work while Daniel Hurst nodded at the parts I wrote," Avery said. "So take your time." "I'm curious what else it could possibly have looked like." Leah exhaled. "I was going to tell you." "No," Avery said. "You were going to manage me." The sentence landed exactly where it needed to. Leah's expression shifted. Not into guilt. Into irritation. And that was useful. Because irritation revealed hierarchy faster than apology ever could. "It's more complicated than you think," Leah said. "It always is when cowardice needs a costume." Leah looked away first. Another useful detail. Then, she said the one thing Avery had not expected her to say this early. "Daniel thinks you've become too valuable to clients and too difficult internally." The room went silent. Not because the sentence was confusing, because it was clean. Clean truths were the most brutal kind. Too valuable to clients. Meaning clients trusted her more than leadership liked. Too difficult internally. Meaning she noticed too much, asked too much, and did not flatter the right people often enough. That was the real crime. Competence. Without obedience. "So, this is punishment," Avery said. Leah shook her head. "No, it's repositioning." There it was again. Language as perfume overwrought. "And where exactly am I being repositioned to?" Avery asked. Leah hesitated. That hesitation told Avery the answer was either humiliating or temporary enough to be a lie. Strategic support. Avery gave a small nod. The title meant nothing, which meant the role meant less. A waiting room with a paycheck. A shelf. A place companies put women they did not want to fire cleanly, but no longer wanted visible. Leah stepped closer. "I tried to protect you." That time, Avery did laugh. Quietly. Once. Not because it was funny. Because betrayal was always most offensive when it came dressed as mercy. At 11:31 a.m., "You should probably stop using the word protect," Avery said. "Unless you want the rest of this conversation to become embarrassing for both of us." Leah's jaw tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," Avery replied. "You already did that when you confused access with legitimacy." For the first time, Leah looked uncertain. Small. Not innocent. Just smaller than the role she had borrowed. And in that moment, Avery understood something important. Leah was involved, but she was not the brain. She was the instrument, ambitious enough to participate, not powerful enough to invent. Daniel was still the center of gravity, which meant Daniel was where the collapse had to begin. Leah placed the file on a nearby cabinet. "There are things you don't understand." Avery stood. Now they were face to face, close enough that neither had room for performance. "Then be useful for the first time today," Avery said. "Help me understand." Leah said nothing. And that was all the confirmation Avery needed. Because silence, again, was never neutral. It was admission without signature. At 11:36 a.m., Avery Caldwell picked up her notebook, walked past Leah, and opened the door. Then she stopped just long enough to say one final thing. "You should have taken something that wasn't alive," she said. "Ideas fight back." She left Leah in the archive room without waiting for a response. And as she walked back toward the center of the office, the fear was gone. Not reduced. Gone. In its place was something colder. Something steadier. A plan beginning to take shape. Because now she had what she needed most. Not proof. Not yet. Something better. Direction. And by the time Daniel Hurst sat across from her at 2:30 p.m., he was not going to be meeting the woman he thought he had already erased. He was going to meet the consequence of underestimating her. At 11:52 a.m., Avery Caldwell didn't return to her desk. She walked past it, past the open floor, past the glass rooms, past the version of herself they had already decided was finished. Because once you understood the game, you stopped playing by its surface rules. You started moving underneath it. She tapped her badge at the elevator and rode down 3 floors. Not to leave, to disappear more effectively. The compliance and audit division sat in the lower levels, far from the polished energy of client-facing teams. No glass walls, no loud ambition, just quiet systems. And records. At 11:58 a.m., Avery stepped into the records terminal room, a place most consultants avoided because it required patience instead of performance. A junior compliance analyst glanced up. "Can I help you?" Avery smiled. The kind of smile that suggested she already belonged there. "I'm looking for archived approval logs on Winterbridge." Internal alignment phase. The analyst hesitated. "Do you have authorization?" "I used to," she said calmly. That answer was not technically correct. But it was not technically wrong either. And confidence often filled the gaps policy left open. He turned back to his screen. Search Terminal 3. At 12:03 p.m., Avery Caldwell sat down and began typing. Project code. Winterbridge. Filter. Internal approvals. Date range. Last 90 days. What she needed was not everything. Just the one thing they assumed no one would look for. The moment before the decision. Because every corporate move left a shadow in the system before it became visible in reality. And shadows could not lie. The first set of logs appeared. Budget drafts. Timeline revisions. Standard noise. Then she narrowed it further. Executive-level approvals only. 3 entries. 2 expected. 1. Not. A pre-authorization flag dated 18 days ago. Approved by D. Hurst. Co-signed. External advisory code redacted. Her fingers paused. External advisory. That meant someone outside the official chain had influenced internal restructuring decisions. That was not illegal, but it was dangerous, because if it had not been disclosed properly, it meant Daniel had introduced external influence before formal alignment, before stakeholder visibility, before compliance review, which meant one thing: he had acted early. And when executives acted early, it was usually because they had something to gain. At 12:11 p.m., Avery opened the attached reference ID. The screen blinked. Once. Access restricted. She didn't react. Restrictions were not walls. They were invitations. She leaned back, thinking. Then she did something most people never thought to do. She didn't try to break in. She tried to go around. Because systems did not fail where they were strongest. They failed where they were assumed irrelevant. She pulled up expense logs again. This time, filtering by external vendor codes linked to Winterbridge. And there it was. A consulting invoice from a boutique firm. Marlowe Strategic Advisory. Small. Discreet. Expensive. Amount. 6 figures. Authorized under discretionary executive budget. No internal announcement. No internal mention. No trace in project summaries. That was the weak point. Not the money. The silence. Because in firms like Halbrecht, money moved quietly all the time. But strategy did not. Strategy required alignment. Unless someone wanted to control the narrative before others could question it. At 12:19 p.m., Avery Caldwell took a photo of the screen with her phone. Not for evidence. Not yet. For memory. Then she closed the terminal and stood. She didn't rush. Rushing created attention. And attention, right now, was the one thing she could not afford. As she walked out, the compliance analyst called after her. Find what you needed? Avery paused just long enough to turn her head slightly. Yes, she said. I found what they forgot to hide. She stepped back into the elevator. This time going up. By 12:27 p.m., she was back on her floor. Nothing had changed. And everything had. People still moved the same. Talked the same. Pretended the same. But now she could see the structure underneath it. Daniel had moved early. Leah had been positioned to execute. The narrative had been prepared in advance. And the meeting at 2:30 p.m. was not a discussion. It was a conclusion they expected her to accept. She walked to her desk, sat down, and opened a blank email. Not to Daniel. Not to HR. To someone else. Someone who mattered more in this moment. Subject line: Winterbridge Strategic Risk Clarification. Recipient: Michael Renner, Chief Client Officer. The one person in the firm whose priority was not internal politics, but client trust. At 12:34 p.m., Avery Caldwell began typing. Her tone was precise, neutral, professional, the kind of tone that did not accuse, but forced attention. Michael, before the 2:30 p.m. alignment discussion, I want to clarify one point regarding Winterbridge. There appears to have been external advisory input, Marlowe Strategic Advisory, introduced prior to full internal alignment and client communication strategy. Given the sensitivity of the transition phase, I want to ensure that client-facing messaging remains consistent with approved internal positioning. Happy to discuss if needed. Avery. She read it once. Then again. No emotion. No blame. Just a question framed as responsibility. That was the third rule of survival. Never attack directly. Expose risk. Because in corporations, people did not react to truth. They reacted to threat. And nothing scared leadership more than the possibility of losing control over a major client. At 12:38 p.m., she hit send. Then she waited. Not anxiously, strategically, because timing was no longer something happening to her. It was something she controlled. At 1:06 p.m., her phone buzzed. Not a reply. A calendar update. New meeting added. 1:30 p.m. Executive Pre-Alignment Discussion. Attendees: Michael Renner, Daniel Hurst, Avery Caldwell. No Leah. That told her everything. The structure had shifted. Daniel was no longer operating uncontested. At 1:12 p.m., Avery Caldwell closed her laptop slowly. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, controlled smile. Not victory. Not yet. Just recognition. Because the moment Michael entered the equation, the game was no longer internal. It was now about exposure. And Daniel's greatest strength, his ability to move quietly, was about to become his greatest weakness. At 1:30 p.m., when she walked into that room, she wouldn't be defending her role. She would be redefining the narrative. And by the time 2:30 p.m. arrived, the meeting they had prepared for her would no longer belong to them. At 1:30 p.m., Avery Caldwell stepped into the conference room without hesitation. Not early. Not late. Exactly on time. Because timing, now, was part of the message. Daniel Hurst was already seated at the far end of the table. Of course he was. Men like Daniel never entered a room second when control was still possible. Michael Renner stood near the window, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up first. Avery. Simple. Neutral. But not dismissive. That mattered. Avery nodded once. Michael. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel. No smile. No softness. Just acknowledgement. And then she sat down. No one spoke for 2 seconds, which, in rooms like this, was long enough to establish hierarchy. Michael broke it. Let's keep this direct, he said, placing his tablet down. I received your email. Avery Caldwell folded her hands lightly on the table. Good. Then we're aligned on why this conversation matters. Daniel leaned back slightly. Relaxed posture. Controlled face. The performance of someone who believed he still owned the narrative. This feels premature, he said calmly. We were planning to address internal adjustments at 2:30 p.m. with HR. There it was. Framing. Reduce the moment. Delay the confrontation. Return control to a safer environment. Avery didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Michael. Client exposure doesn't operate on internal schedules, she said, especially not during a transition phase that hasn't been formally aligned. Michael's gaze sharpened, just slightly. But enough. Explain that, he said. Daniel spoke before she could. There is no exposure, he said. We've engaged a third-party advisory to strengthen positioning. Standard practice. Smooth, clean, technically correct, but incomplete. Avery Caldwell nodded once. I agree, she said. It is standard practice. Daniel glanced at her. That was the first crack. Because agreement, in the wrong moment, created uncertainty. Avery continued. What isn't standard, she said evenly, is introducing external advisory influence before internal alignment without updating client-facing messaging protocols. Michael looked at Daniel. Not accusing. Evaluating. Daniel's tone didn't change. We're still in internal phases, he said. Nothing has been communicated externally. And there it was, the sentence that felt safe. The sentence he had likely repeated to himself. The sentence that assumed control, meant silence. Avery Caldwell tilted her head slightly. Not directly, she said. Silence. Michael's eyes moved back to her. What does that mean? This was the moment. Not to attack. To reveal. Avery reached into her folder and slid a single printed page across the table. Not aggressively. Just enough to enter the space. Michael picked it up. Daniel didn't move. That was his mistake. Because the moment he chose not to engage, he lost the chance to shape interpretation. Michael read. His expression didn't change. But his posture did. Slightly forward now. More focused. This is Marlowe strategic, he said. Authorized under discretionary budget. Daniel nodded once. Correct. Michael looked at the date. Then at the project code. Then back at Daniel. Transition leadership. One word. But it carried weight. Daniel answered immediately. Preliminary structuring. Confident. Prepared. Still in control. Or, so he thought. Avery Caldwell spoke quietly. Before stakeholder alignment, she said. Michael didn't look away from Daniel. Before stakeholder alignment? Daniel paused. Just for a fraction of a second. But in rooms like this, fractions mattered. We were preparing options, he said. And there it was. Preparation. A softer word. A safer word. But also, a revealing one. Because preparation meant intent. And intent, without alignment, was risk. Michael set the paper down. Now he leaned back. Not relaxed. Calculating. Let me be clear, he said. Have we introduced strategic direction into this account that has not been formally aligned internally or communicated consistently to the client? Silence. Daniel answered. No. One word. Clean. Final. And wrong. Avery Caldwell didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She was no longer playing against Daniel. She was playing through Michael. At 1:38 p.m., she spoke again. Then we should be comfortable confirming that no external advisory frameworks have influenced internal restructuring assumptions currently reflected in draft materials or informal client discussions. Michael turned to her. That's a strong statement. Avery nodded. It should be. Then she added, calmly. Because if that statement isn't accurate, we don't have a strategy problem. She paused. Just long enough. We have a trust problem. The word landed differently. Trust. Not process. Not alignment. Trust. That was Michael's territory. That was what he protected. Daniel's jaw tightened. Not visibly to most. But enough. Because now the conversation had shifted. From internal politics to client risk. And in that space, he had less control. Michael looked at Daniel again. Longer this time. We don't operate in gray areas on client trust, he said. You know that. Daniel nodded. Of course. But the rhythm was gone. The smoothness had cracks now. Small, but visible. Michael tapped the paper once. Walk me through exactly when Marlowe was engaged, and how that input has been contained internally. Not if. How. That was the shift. The assumption had changed. Containment implied risk. Daniel started speaking. Controlled. Measured. But now he was explaining. Not leading. And every explanation created surface area. Every detail created vulnerability. Avery Caldwell said nothing. She didn't need to. Because the fourth rule of survival was simple. Once the right person starts asking questions, you stop talking. At 1:44 p.m., Michael stood. That ended it. Not formally, but effectively. We'll pause here, he said. I want full clarity on this, before the 2:30 p.m. discussion. He looked at Avery. Thank you for raising it. Then, at Daniel. We'll talk in 10 minutes. Not we'll continue. We'll talk. Different tone. Different implication. Michael walked out first. Daniel remained seated. For 2 seconds. Then 3. Then he looked at Avery Caldwell. No smile. No performance. Just calculation. You're making this bigger than it is, he said quietly. Avery met his gaze. For the first time directly. No, she said. I'm making it visible. Another silence. Short. Sharp. Then she stood. At 1:46 p.m., as she reached the door, Daniel spoke again. You think this protects you? Avery Caldwell paused. Not turning. Just enough to answer. No, she said. It exposes you. And then she left. Walking back into the office that no longer felt like a place she was losing, but a system she was beginning to control. Because the meeting at 2:30 p.m. was no longer about her role. It was about Daniel's decisions. And when the subject changes, power follows. At 2:30 p.m., Avery Caldwell walked into the HR conference room. Same building. Same firm. But a completely different battlefield. The room was smaller than the executive suite upstairs. No glass walls. No skyline. Just a rectangular table, neutral lighting, and 2 people who believed this meeting was already decided. Sandra Klein from HR sat on the left. Composed. Measured. The kind of presence designed to feel safe while delivering irreversible outcomes. Daniel Hurst sat at the head of the table. Back in position. Or at least, trying to be. Avery, Sandra said with a professional smile. Thank you for joining us. Avery Caldwell nodded and took her seat. No folder this time. No visible preparation. That was intentional. Because the most dangerous preparation was the kind no one could see. Sandra folded her hands. We wanted to discuss a realignment of your role within the firm. There it was. The script. Polished. Neutral. Pre-approved. Daniel didn't speak. Not yet. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment Avery would react emotionally. Waiting for resistance he could manage. Waiting for her to confirm the version of her they had already written. She didn't give it to him. At 2:32 p.m., Avery Caldwell spoke first. I assume this discussion is connected to the Winterbridge account. Sandra glanced briefly at Daniel. Just a flicker. But enough. Yes, Sandra said. Partially. Partially. Another soft word. Another attempt to keep things controlled. Avery nodded. Then before we continue, she said calmly, I want to clarify whether this meeting reflects updated executive understanding following the 1:30 p.m. discussion with Michael Renner. Silence. Sandra's expression didn't change. But Daniel's did. Slightly. Because that sentence did one thing very clearly. It introduced a higher authority into a room that was meant to operate without one. Sandra turned to Daniel. Not obviously. Just enough. Daniel, she said. He leaned forward slightly. Calm again. Reconstructed. The conversation with Michael is ongoing, he said. This meeting is focused on your role. There it was. Separation. Divide the issues. Control the narrative. Proceed as planned. Avery Caldwell tilted her head slightly. Those 2 things are no longer separate, she said. Sandra interjected gently. Avery, this is an internal discussion about fit and structure. Fit. Structure. Words designed to feel objective. Words that hid decisions already made. Avery looked at her. Not confrontational. Just precise. Then let's make it objective, she said. She reached into her bag. Now she had a folder. Thin. Simple. But real. She placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were 3 printed pages. Not a stack. Not overwhelming. Just enough. Because overwhelming information created confusion. Focused information created impact. At 2:34 p.m., Avery Caldwell slid the first page toward Sandra. Winterbridge draft deck, she said. Slide 11. Sandra glanced down. Then, at Daniel. Daniel didn't move. That framework was authored by me, Avery continued. The metadata was removed. She slid the second page. Project access logs. My permissions were reduced without notification. Then the third. Marlowe strategic advisory engagement. Pre-alignment. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't accuse. Didn't label anything as wrongdoing. She simply placed facts in sequence. And let the room do the rest. Sandra looked at the pages again. More carefully now. Not as HR. As someone recognizing risk. Daniel spoke. Controlled. We're adjusting team structures to better support. Avery Caldwell interrupted. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just precisely. At 2:35 p.m., I'm not questioning adjustments, she said. I'm questioning timing and visibility. The interruption was surgical. It didn't attack him. It removed his ability to finish a safe sentence. Sandra looked between them. This isn't about attribution, she said carefully. And that was her mistake. Because she had just defined the frame. Attribution. Credit. Recognition. All small things. All manageable things. Avery shook her head slightly. No, she said. It's about exposure. The word landed again. Stronger this time. Because now it had context. Documents. Sequence. Timing. She leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive. Just engaged. If internal restructuring decisions are being influenced by external advisory before alignment, she said, and if client-facing materials reflect those assumptions, she paused, letting the structure build. Then this isn't a role fit issue. Silence. Then the line. Clean. Cold. Final. It's a governance issue. The room changed. Not dramatically, but definitively, because governance was not HR territory. Governance was oversight. Audit. Risk. Escalation. Sandra sat back slightly. Not defensive. Recalculating. Daniel didn't move, but something in his posture tightened. Because the meeting he had prepared no longer existed. Sandra spoke more carefully now. Are you suggesting there's been a breach of process? Avery Caldwell met her gaze. I'm suggesting that before we discuss my role, she said, we should be clear on whether the current structure of this account reflects fully aligned and transparent decision-making. No accusation. Just a question. But a question that could not be ignored. Sandra closed the folder slowly. That gesture meant something. It meant she was no longer reading. She was thinking. At 2:38 p.m., she turned to Daniel. I think we need to pause the role discussion, she said. There it was. Not dramatic. Not loud. But final. Daniel's jaw tightened again. This time, harder. Avery is making assumptions based on incomplete context, he said. Still controlled. But now, defensive. And that shift was everything. Because once a leader became defensive in front of HR, the perception changed. From authority to liability. Avery Caldwell didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because the fifth rule of survival was simple. Once the system starts protecting itself, it stops protecting individuals. Sandra nodded slightly. I'd like to review this further before we proceed, she said. We'll reschedule. Reschedule. Not continue. Not finalize. Reschedule. The script was broken. The outcome was delayed. Control had shifted. At 2:41 p.m., Avery Caldwell closed her folder, calmly, without rush, as if this had always been the plan. She stood. Of course, she said. Then she looked at Sandra. Thank you for taking the time to look at it properly. Then at Daniel. Just for a second. No smile. No emotion. Just clarity. Then she walked out. Back into the hallway. Back into the same office. But nothing felt the same. Because she wasn't being removed anymore. She was being reconsidered. And Daniel was being watched. At 2:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. A message. From Michael Renner. We need to talk tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. No explanation. None needed. Because in firms like this, meetings at 8 a.m. were not scheduled for routine alignment. They were scheduled for decisions. Avery Caldwell looked at the message, then locked her phone. And, for the first time that day, she allowed herself a full breath. Not relief. Not victory. Something better. Control. Because they hadn't fired her. They hadn't moved her. They hadn't even finished the conversation. And in corporate warfare, the person who controlled when the conversation ended controlled what happened next. At 7:58 a.m., Avery Caldwell stepped into the executive floor before most of the office lights were fully on. Early, but not rushed. Because this meeting was not about survival anymore. It was about positioning. The hallway was quieter than usual. No chatter. No movement. Just the low hum of systems waking up. At 8 a.m., she entered Michael Renner's office. He was already there, standing by the window, looking out over the city. Not dramatic. Just thoughtful. He didn't turn immediately. That told her something. This conversation mattered. More than the one yesterday. Avery, he said, still facing the glass. Sit. She did. Calm. Composed. Michael turned then. Tablet in hand. I spent last night reviewing everything, he said. Not everything. Everything. A small difference. A critical one. He placed the tablet down and looked directly at her. You were right to raise it. No praise. No emotion. Just acknowledgement. That was worth more. Avery Caldwell nodded once. I assumed clarity would be useful. Michael almost smiled. Almost. It usually is, he said. When it arrives early enough. He walked back to his desk and sat down. Daniel moved faster than alignment allowed, he continued. And he did it quietly. No hesitation. No defense. Just fact. That creates exposure, Michael said. Not just operationally. Structurally. Avery said nothing. Because silence, now, was power. Michael leaned forward slightly. Leah Mercer's role in this, he added, was predictable. That word again. Predictable. Not shocking. Not surprising. Just expected behavior in a system that rewarded ambition without oversight. She followed the opportunity, he said. Daniel created it. Clean. Simple. Accurate. At 8:06 a.m., Michael folded his hands. So let's talk about you. Not your role. You. That shift mattered. Avery Caldwell, he said. You were being repositioned. Past tense. Was. Not are. Not will be. Was. The decision had already been undone. Without announcement. Without apology. Just. Corrected. But that's no longer the direction we're taking, he said. Of course not. Because now the variables had changed. Visibility had entered the system. And visibility forced recalibration. Michael tapped the desk lightly. Winterbridge is too critical to destabilize right now, he said. We need continuity. Continuity. Another word that sounded neutral, but carried weight. Because continuity meant one thing very clearly. She was still central. More than that. She was necessary. I want you to stay on the account, he said. Not as support. Not as shadow. As lead. There it was. Not a promotion announcement. Not a celebration. Just a decision. Precise. Final. Avery Caldwell held his gaze. Steady. Understood, she said. Michael watched her for a second longer. Measuring. Not competence. That had already been proven. Control. Daniel will remain involved, he added. But under review. Under review. Corporate language. For something already decided, but not yet public. And Leah? Avery asked. Michael didn't hesitate. She'll be reassigned. No explanation. None needed. Because in firms like this, reassignment was rarely lateral. It was quiet distance. He leaned back slightly. One more thing, he said. This time his tone changed. Not formal. Not distant. Just direct. You didn't escalate, he said. You exposed risk. A small pause. That's the difference between reaction and leadership. The sentence stayed in the air. Not heavy, but significant. Because it wasn't about what she had done. It was about what she had demonstrated. And in systems like this, demonstration was currency. At 8:12 a.m., Avery Caldwell stood. Not abruptly. Just when the moment was complete. Thank you, she said. No extra words. No overplay. Because power did not need decoration. As she reached the door, Michael spoke again. You understand something most people don't, he said. She paused. Visibility isn't about being seen, he continued. It's about being undeniable. Avery gave a small nod. Then she left, walking back through the executive floor, through the hallway, through the same office that had tried to erase her. But now, every step felt different. Not because people suddenly respected her. Most of them didn't even know what had happened. And that was the point. Real power in places like this was rarely loud. It didn't need witnesses. It needed outcomes. At 8:26 a.m., she reached her desk, sat down, opened her laptop, and pulled up the Winterbridge file. Her file. Restored. Clean. With her name back in the metadata. No announcement. No apology. Just correction. Leah's access had changed. From primary editor to viewer. A small shift. A silent one. But meaningful. Because roles in systems like this were not declared, they were reflected. Her inbox refreshed. A new calendar invite appeared. 9 a.m. Winterbridge, Strategy Alignment. Attendees. Michael Renner. Daniel Hurst. Avery Caldwell. Her name. First. She looked at it for a second. Then closed the notification. Not because it didn't matter. Because it didn't need to. At 8:31 a.m., Avery Caldwell picked up her notebook, opened to the page she had written the day before. If they built this quietly, I will destroy it precisely. She looked at the sentence, then added one more line beneath it. Control isn't taken loudly. It's established when no one can undo it. She closed the notebook. And this time, she smiled. Not at them. Not at the outcome. At herself. Because they hadn't just underestimated her. They had misunderstood her entirely. And that was the most dangerous mistake anyone could make. Deep lessons. The most dangerous attack is not confrontation. It is quiet removal. Learn to notice absence before it becomes your reality. In corporate systems, you are rarely pushed out directly. You are slowly disconnected until you disappear. Awareness is your first defense. People don't always betray you out of hatred. Many do it out of ambition, fear, or opportunity. Understand motives, not emotions. Competence alone is never enough. If your work can be taken, rewritten, or reassigned, you are still replaceable. The higher you rise, the less the game is about performance, and the more it is about control of narrative. Never rush to defend yourself. The moment you react emotionally, you give others the power to define you. Precision defeats aggression. A single, well-placed truth can dismantle an entire structure built on silence. Do not fight people. Fight the system they rely on. When the system turns, individuals fall on their own. Exposure is more powerful than accusation. Accusations create resistance. Exposure creates consequences. Power in corporate environments is not loud. It is the ability to shift outcomes without raising your voice. The person who controls the conversation controls the future. Silence is not weakness. When used correctly, it becomes a weapon that forces others to reveal themselves. Trust is the highest currency in any organization. The moment trust is questioned, even powerful people become vulnerable. You do not need to destroy your opponent. You only need to make their position unsustainable. Never try to win by proving you are right. Win by making the system recognize that ignoring you is a risk. Real leadership is not about being visible. It is about becoming undeniable. When they try to erase you, do not chase visibility. Build leverage. The strongest revenge is not emotional. It is structural. It changes the outcome, not just the moment. You are not defined by what they take from you. You are defined by what you can no longer be denied. And finally, control is never taken in a single moment. It is built quietly until no one can take it away from you.